This is our 20th anniversary of this department, and we started in 1993. And I wasn't here, but several people are here who were here. And I'd like to introduce them to begin with. Sherry Little is here. Sherry, stand up. And Carol Sweeter Brown is here today. Carol. And Ann Johns is here. Ann Johns, stand up. And Ann, busy person that she is, has another engagement shortly. So she'd like to, because she can't stay around for the extravagant event we have here, she'd like to say a few words to you to begin. So, Ann, the podium is yours.
You made a mistake.
Only one piece of paper.
Oh, that's right, I only have one. That's good. Because you want to hear Sue, and she's terrific, and I'm really sorry not to hear you. Is somebody taping? Yes, good. Okay, we'll collect the tape. I want to say a little about, I'm one of the founding mothers, there's several here, and a founding father. Where are you, Cesar? Okay, of this department. In 1990s, early 1990s, San Diego State was chaotic. How many were here in some form or another? The young people weren't, but some of us were. And we were trying to fire our president, Tom Day, the sort of Richard Nixon of San Diego State. And we didn't have much VP help. And so the deans were running the show. It was a very interesting time. And fortunately, Leslie Johnson and I were in the dean's office, but even more importantly, Sherry and Shirley Rose, Sherry Little and Shirley Rose, were in the English department, and they were approached about writing a proposal for this department, which they did. And they did a beautiful job. Then they said, but why don't you expand it and make it more accessible, la, la, la. So a group of us, I'm going to name names. Some of you know who they were. Peg Hallahan, Joyce Nauer, Martha Johnson, Elise Miller. You know those people. Some of them are no longer with us. Some of them came to the funerals for some of those folks. Anyway, we all got together with Carol as well. Cesar contributed, and we put together a proposal and then I would run from dean to dean saying, is this accessible? Can we do it? La, la, la. Because, of course, we wanted a piece that would work rhetorically. And I guess it did. The vote was 39-11 in the Senate. We're very pleased to tell you. It went on. Carol became chair, and then left for the dean's office, and guess who ended up being? You did leave for the dean's office. How long were you chair, sweetheart? Anyway, not long enough, because I then became chair, and I was really unhappy about it. We did a search, and Ellen Quandall, where are you, found Glenn McLish's application, and said, let's look at this guy. So we did, and we invited him, and he gave this great talk, which was called, What Do You Do When You're Applying for a Job? What kind of presentation do you give? It was a wonderful rhetorical piece. Us old guard left his presentation and said, yes, this is it. Then I went to the dean's office, and Carol was sitting there with Glenn. I broke into tears, fell on my knees, and said, would you please come? And the rest is, of course, history. I think we owe a great deal to Glenn McLish. He is, despite his principles, he's much admired by the administration. Much admired by the CSU. He's on the ETS. He was even head of the English Council, which adamantly opposed this department years ago. So we're really pleased that he can balance and keep some of us who are more hysterical in line and other things. We have a wonderful tenured faculty, but I'd like to say a bit about some of our lecturers. Would you raise your hands, some of you here who've been here for a long time? Yeah, good, terrific. This is a great group. And I want to mention some that are not here. They're probably out working somewhere. Callie Linford and Leanne Bryson have been all over the county doing wonderful things. They're now at Hoover High School. Maureen Kelly took over freshman success, and with Leslie Johnson kept it going as long as possible. Janet Templeton, as you know, ably supported by Jamie Madden and others. Carl, for example, is doing a lovely job with developmental writing. Katie Hughes is loved by the famous guy in psychology, what's his name? And also doing online programs, but I could go on. I think what we need to do now is to cheer Glenn McLeish for making this department what it is, with all of your help. Thank you, Glenn. Okay. I told you I shouldn't.
Kind of you.
Oh, it's so hard to be a chair.
But this isn't about me. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to thank Suzanne Bordelon for really setting up this meeting. This was her idea, this particular lecture, and she applied for the funds and invited Sue, and so thank you so much for your help setting this up. Now, to our speaker. Professor Susan MacLeod is Research Professor and Writing Program Distinguished Scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is former director of the writing program there. Besides being involved in writing program administration for most of her career, she has also been active in writing across the curriculum efforts, particularly faculty development. She has served on many committees of the Conference on College Composition and Communication, including the Committee on the Major in Writing Studies. Sue began her career here at San Diego State in English, when rhetoric and writing studies was only a gleam in the few forward-thinking professors' eyes, and moved on to Washington State University before arriving in Santa Barbara. Sue's publications include such books as Writing Program Administration, Composing a Community, A History of Writing Across the Curriculum, Strengthening Programs for Writing Across the Curriculum, Writing Across the Curriculum, A Guide to Developing Programs, Writing About the World, that's a multicultural textbook, Notes on the Heart, Affective Issues in the Writing Classroom, and WAC for the New Millennium, Strategies for Continuing Writing Across the Curriculum Programs, as well as numerous articles on writing across the curriculum and writing program administration. One of these articles, called Accelerated Classes and the Writers at the Bottom, a Local Assessment Story, co-authored with Heather Horn and Richard Haswell, and published in College Composition and Communication, will be discussed in my 640 class next week, and Sue will be present to direct a larger discussion of writing assessment, and thank you in advance for coming to my class. Sue is editor of Perspectives on Writing, the book series with the WAC Clearinghouse, and co-editor with Margot Sovin of the Writing Program Administration book series with Parlor Press. Sue is a particular friend and supporter of our department. She has donated books and journals to the department, visited our classes, and has provided expert consultation for us. Earlier this semester, she anchored the external panel of scholars who reviewed our department and provided an extremely helpful report. I expect this report to yield significant benefits for the department and, more to the point, our many students in the next few years. And I'll be meeting with the administration next week to go over the report, and I feel very positive that we're going to have some good results from that meeting, and I thank you very much for your hard work. And now, Sue MacLeod.
Thanks, Glenn, for that kind introduction. I have to say that I've done a lot of outside reviews of programs and departments, and this one was a real pleasure. It was really wonderful to see all the things that you're doing, especially since, as Glenn said, when I left San Diego State, this department was still a gleam in the eyes of the founding mothers, many of whom are here. Let me make sure that everybody has handouts. I have 2 handouts. If you have not gotten them, they are back in the back. And one of the handouts is a bibliography. Some of these things I will be referring to in my talk. Others are simply bits of information that might be helpful to you if you are interested in the issue of independent writing units and the major. And then the other is a list of learning outcomes for the major with an almost illegible a little spreadsheet on the back. This is the way we could get it on the paper, but this spreadsheet is also on the web if you want to take a look at it. It's a little easier to see it there. Let me start by defining some terms. You will notice that I have changed the title of my talk a little bit. And I realized once I had talked to Suzanne about it that I used the word departments, but a lot of the independent writing units are not departments. They are this thing called a unit in university parlance. A lot of them are programs, and the difference between a program and a department, if you don't know, is that departments are usually freestanding entities. They have their own budget, they have their own, usually a department leader of some kind, usually a head. The one that I directed at UC Santa Barbara, from which I'm now retired, was a program. And it had its own budget, but it was not necessarily freestanding. We did have just 2 tenure-track members, for example, and the rest were lecturers. So departments and programs are not the same thing, but sometimes programs are departments in waiting. And so when I talk about the number of independent writing units, I'm talking about both departments and programs. And I'd like to also say a word about my subtitle, Past, Present, and Future. I don't intend to try to forecast the future. As a wise person once said, it's very hard to predict things, especially the future. And that person was either Yogi Berra or Niels Bohr. You can take your pick, one of the two. But I will be pointing out some things that I think we need to think about. When I say we, those of us who are in the discipline, need to think about as we move ahead after this first period of independence. I'm starting with a brief history of where writing departments and programs come from, because that history helps to explain a lot about some of the issues that we face right now. And it's also because I think those of us in the discipline need to know a bit about where we come from. It's a wise child who knows its own parents. So let's start with the past. Where did writing programs come from and departments? This story, like a lot of academic stories, starts in Harvard. In 1869, the president of Harvard University at that time, Charles William Eliot, transformed the curriculum of the entire institution. Some of you may know this story. Suzanne is a historian, so she probably knows about this. It went from a curriculum that was almost entirely focused on rhetoric and on the classics to one that divided things up according to the way that the German university was organized. And so departments were born, disciplines were born. And one of these departments was English. So English, the parent department for a lot of writing programs and departments, is itself only about 150 years old. And it's kind of nice to remember this when we think about the history of rhetoric, which, as many of you know, is a lot older than that. And so I just like to remind myself of that every once in a while. Here's where I would like to quote from a famous essay by William Raleigh Parker that some of you may know, Where Do English Departments Come From? He uses a domestic metaphor that I think is rather fitting. He discusses English as a child who is now estranged from both parents, and here's a quote. It, that is English's mother, the eldest daughter of rhetoric, was oratory, or what we now prefer to call public speaking, or simply speech. Its father was philology, or what we now call linguistics. Their marriage was short-lived, and English is therefore a child of a broken home. This unhappy fact accounts, perhaps, for its early feeling of independence and its later bitterness towards both parents. That's the end of the quote. The earliest English departments were big tent affairs. Things like speech, linguistics, comparative literature, theater, journalism, all those were under the heading of English. But gradually, over the years, as these sort of subunits of subdisciplines of English began to develop their own methodologies, their own research, their own way of doing things, they formed their own departments and they left English. And when you look at this history of English departments and where they've been, it's probably not surprising that writing would be the next to walk out of English. How writing became part of English is really accidental. And the way that Parker tells the story, when the National Education Association recommended that literature and composition be united at the secondary level, college entrance exams thereafter were writing about literature. Literature and writing thus became intertwined. And it's really interesting, by the way, to look at some of these early college entrance examinations. And I couldn't resist quoting one from 1874 from this what became the college boards. So here's the writing and literature exam. Write a short composition upon one of the subjects given below. Before beginning to write, consider what you have to say on the subject. Select and arrange your thoughts in logical order. Carefully revise your composition, correcting all errors in spelling, punctuation, grammar, division by paragraphs, and expression, and making each sentence as clear and forcible as possible. If time permits, make a clean copy of the revised work. And here are the topics that they were to write on. The character of Sir Richard Steele. The Duke of Marlborough, as portrayed by Thackeray. The style of Henry Esmond. Thackeray's account of the Pretender's visit to England, and dueling in the age of Queen Anne. If you want to see more of these, look at Norbert Eliot's book, On a Scale. They're lots of fun to read. After the social upheaval of the Civil War, a new group of students began to enroll in Harvard, and these were not necessarily the sons of gentlemen, as had happened before. These were the sons of farmers and laborers, workers. And Harvard faculty, looking at the results of entrance exams like the one question I just read you, decided that these students could not write at the college level. So freshman English was born as remediation. It was born to help these young men clean up their language, learn how to use grammar, spelling, and punctuation in the way that suited a gentleman. And so first year composition, which when I started out was called freshman English, was born under the shadow of remediation. And that's a shadow that we still deal with on occasion. So that's the slide that should have been up earlier, sorry. Okay, so now fast forward 100 years. The 1970s and the 1980s were times of enormous change. Some of us were there for that and remember the Vietnam War in particular, the women's movement, the civil rights movement. All this meant a lot of social upheaval. And the university's curriculum as a whole, not just the English curriculum, changed incredibly fast during this time. This was a time of cannon busting in English departments, as you may remember. All of a sudden, it was no longer Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, but we were reading other authors. The historical framework that English studies had been hung on at that time was basically done away with. It was also a time of a new wave of immigration, in part because of the war, the Vietnam War, and also of open enrollments, both of which wound up emphasizing both ESL and what we now call, thanks to Mina Shaughnessy, basic writing. Once again, university faculty discovered that students couldn't write. These new students, you know, the immigrants and these ESL students. And the basic writing students. Some of you may remember, those of you who were around at that time, the popular Newsweek magazine story, Why Johnny Can't Write. That managed to jumpstart the Writing Across the Curriculum program. New journals sprang up to publish the research that people were doing to try to help these new students, this new group of students. We rediscovered rhetoric, thanks to Ed Corbett. New professional organizations arose, including the Council of Writing Program Administrators, which dates from the late 1970s. This was a time, as Steve North has put it, that composition with a small c became composition with a large C. During this time, graduate programs also developed and began to turn out new PhDs in composition and rhetoric. Those of us of a certain age have degrees in English, by the way, because there were no such things as composition degrees, PhDs in rhetoric and composition. So these new PhDs in rhetoric and composition took positions in English departments to direct the writing programs that were growing in order to meet this new wave of students. But trouble was brewing. English departments, as you perhaps know, are famously contentious. There are a lot of jokes among administrators at the university about English departments. Excuse me, it's my allergies. I think one of the kindest ones is wherever there are 2 English professors, there are 3 opinions. I could tell you others that are not quite so kind. But I can tell you a story about the San Diego State English department when I was here. During that time, maybe still, they could not agree on much. And during the late 1970s, they couldn't agree on a chair. They had 2 candidates, and the votes were split 50-50 between these 2 rival candidates, and no one would budge. So the dean came to a department meeting to try to reason with people and figure out what to do. And after the meeting descended into a shouting match, which was not unusual for that time, he finally called for order, and he said, "This department does not need a chair. This department needs an exorcist." But one thing that English professors mostly agreed on, and I think still agree on, they don't care to teach writing. Composition was something they had to do as first-year TAs, and for many of them, I think it was a sort of fraternity hazing that they had to get through in order to do what they really wanted to do, which was to teach literature. Many were, and many still are, contemptuous of both composition and those of us who teach it. The spark that ignited the move towards separation of writing from English can be dated to Maxine Hairston's talk. It was a chair's address to the Conference on College Composition and Communication in 1985. And in this talk, which has sometimes been referred to as our profession's Declaration of Independence, Hairston described the realities of many English departments at that time. Here she said, "Literature faculty, like the Chinese mandarins of old, despised the useful and practical, and therefore looked at composition and their composition colleagues with contempt. It is impossible to engage in a dialogue with these faculty," she said. "We are not in a rhetorical situation with them. They are not listening. What we need to do," she said, "is to stop trying to get them to listen and instead do what minorities and women had been doing the decade before her talk, and that was to find our own identity, to reach out beyond the department to find allies, to move to other universities where our work would be appreciated, which is what I did, and ultimately, and here's Parker's domestic metaphor again, divorce ourselves from English and form our own departments. And I should add that Hairston's own department at UT Austin did just that the year after her talk. How many of you were there for that talk? I was, Sherry was, Cesar was. I wish all of you could have been here at that talk. It was just, the effect was electric. What she said was what a lot of us had been feeling for a long time, but thinking, it must just be me. Like a lot of women in bad marriages, we were sort of internalizing this issue. And after that, I think people really got a sense that, okay, this is not just me. This is the situation. And here I can't help mentioning one of the songs by the Composition Blues Band, which used to play at 4Cs and RTE. I don't think it does anymore, but it was a wonderful group while it lasted. Marvin Diogenes, who's now at Stanford, was the one who composed the lyrics. And here are a couple of lines from sung to the tune of "Born in the USA," but the song is scorned by the MLA. My favorite lines: "Up for tenure, case was strong, publications were all wrong, taught too much, same old song, couldn't list any MLA panel, they wanted tweed, but I come in flannel, scorned by the MLA." And that was not an unusual situation for people in English departments. So not 10 years after Maxine's talk, there were enough independent writing programs or departments that had left home, left English, and formed their own units. And there were enough of these to form a special interest group at 4Cs, at the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Barry Maid, who heads that special interest group, estimates that there are probably about 50 independent writing units right now, maybe more. Nobody's done a formal census. Somebody really should do this. Somebody at 4Cs should actually do a survey to find out how many there are. And as you heard, the department here at San Diego State separated from English in 1993. And there's an article in your bibliography by Sherry Little and Shirley Rose that presents a sort of sanitized version of that split, so you can read it if you'd like. You can check with Sherry about the real story after this is over. I understand Barry Maid is coming here next year for the landmark.
speaker.
Oh, great, yeah, well, you will enjoy him. One of the books on your bibliography is a book called Field of Dreams. It's a series of essays edited by Peggy O'Neill and her colleagues, and it was published about 10 years ago. It tells the stories of some of these units and how they separated from their home departments. And as with a lot of divorces, there's a lot of angst in these stories. Barry Maid calls them separation stories, you know, what happened when I left my husband kind of thing. But there's also a new book in the works now, and it's going to be published in the series that I edit, the Perspectives on Writing series, that will be independent units, you know, 10 years later, after the dust has settled, after the budget has been figured out, you know, after the alimony has been paid, all of that. And my guess is that this new book will not have quite as much Sturm und Drang in it. What's interesting to me as an administrator, as a college administrator, is that a lot of these units had, at the beginning, and some still have, a very odd structure. In research universities, elsewhere too, but mostly in research universities, they consist of a general education program, you know, writing that's required for everybody, and a graduate program, and nothing in between, a missing middle, no major. And unlike most units, they consisted of and still consist primarily of contingent faculty. Those people taught the service courses, the tenured faculty taught the graduate students. In other words, these units are an anomaly in the university, where the norm is that you start out with a major and some service courses, and then you develop a graduate program afterwards. So in some sense, our discipline has done things backwards. I'm not saying that's bad, it's just unusual. It's just odd. So let's talk about the present. When majors are being developed to fill that gap in the middle of the curricular offerings, as Glenn said, that I served as the first chair of the 4Cs Committee on the Major, and we did our first survey of writing majors in 2005-2006. We found 45 institutions with such a major, as you can see in that first little block. The 2008 update, which was the one that the article on the major that I did with one of my colleagues was published. We used those data from 2008. That included 68 majors and tracks. And I just was in contact with the present chair of that committee to ask her what their latest survey is, because that committee is charged with updating this frequently. There's supposed to be a public, an official update very soon. But she said their latest data show that there are now 88 majors. So that's a remarkable growth in just in the last few years. And your own department will soon join that number. You have a major, as I'm sure all of you know. So it's amazingly rapid growth in the context of the university, where growth is usually glacial. This is pretty exciting. There's some other markers of growth besides the growth of the major, or the number of places where there are a major. 40 years ago, there were no PhD programs in rhetoric and composition. Now, there's 65. 40 years ago, there was exactly one scholarly journal in our field, and that was College Composition and Communication. And now there are more than 60, depending on how you count. Probably, that's a conservative estimate. That comes from my colleague at UCSB, When you give a research librarian a task like this, they love it, you know, so she went and counted for me. And finally, this is the big one. We have been considered a subfield of English in all of the statistical work that comes out of the Department of Education. And we have just been recently, as a discipline, been declared an emerging discipline by the National Research Council, which means that the PhDs that are awarded will no longer be classified under English, will have a different classification. We will no longer be considered just part of English. We will be our own thing. We can be rightfully pleased about this. But of course, as all disciplines, we have some issues. We got a lot of work still ahead of us. We're still pretty new. And I'll mention a few of those issues here just to suggest what we need to be thinking about in the future. And the first one is, as an emerging discipline, we're still not agreed on what we call ourselves. Our service course, our ubiquitous service course, has gone from being something called freshman English to first-year composition. But the broad term composition is probably not very useful to us, and we didn't really find that alone in any of the names of these departments or the majors. It is too broad. And also, if you look up that word using the Library of Congress system, which has a controlled vocabulary, you know what you find? Music. So, you know, that's really not going to be very helpful. Writing is what we do, but that term for the general public usually means creative writing, and I'll bet that Glenn probably gets a lot of calls from people saying, where can I take a creative writing course? So, you know, and usually creative writing courses are still owned by English, and they're very jealous of them. They really don't want to let them go. In fact, when I was at UCSB, we had creative writing courses on the books in English. English hadn't taught them in years. And so I called them up and said, well, you know, we've got guys who could teach this. They'd love to teach it. They have MFAs and all that. Oh, no, we might teach them sometime. And so they didn't want to give them up. That happens a lot. When you try to add rhetoric to writing or to composition as the name for what you do, sometimes you get grief from communications departments who feel that they own rhetoric, and you can't do that. When our committee did our first survey, we found multiple names for both the separate departments and the major. And my personal favorite among these is the program at Stanford, which is called the Program in Writing and Rhetoric, PWR for short, pronounced POWER. And so all the students talk about taking their POWER courses, which I rather like. We also found rhetoric and writing, composition and rhetoric, or rhetoric and composition, technical communication, professional and technical writing, writing studies, and the name of your department, rhetoric and writing studies. And you can thank Shirley and Sherry for that name. They spent a lot of time trying to figure out, and Carol too, probably, no, it was Shirley and Sherry. Okay, all right, I got it right. They spent a lot of time figuring out what to call the new baby when the baby was born. And I think my own sense is that writing studies is what we should be looking at, however else we combine it with something else, because it's parallel to other units in the university. You have women's studies, you have these various ethnic studies programs, and so it's not something that is unfamiliar in terms of how people think about you. And I'm hoping that, you know, in the future, as people figure this out, more and more departments will have a name that is close to what you call yours. But the other issue, and I think it's even more serious than what do we call ourselves, how do we name ourselves, and that's the major. Our committee spent a lot of time looking at different majors across the country in the 2008 data, and we found two different types, which we reported on in the article in the C's, which is in your bibliography. First, there's what we came to call the liberal arts writing major, which made up about half the count of the ones in that, it's no longer up there, but you know, the 2008 data, not the most recent data. This major consisted of a combination of writing and literature, requiring such courses as Chaucer, Milton, Shakespeare, and creative writing as well as writing courses. The only theory in some of these majors was literary theory, and perhaps not surprisingly, most of these majors were offered in English departments. The second type of major we chose to call professional rhetorical, and it was more common, as you might guess, in independent writing units and programs. It consisted primarily of courses in rhetoric and writing. Some were almost exclusively technical and professional writing, and some, like the one proposed for your department here, focuses more on rhetoric in general. And just an aside, I'll be really interested to see what the latest data show in terms of the breakdown. My sense is that as we have more and more independent writing programs and units, we will have more and more of this second kind of major without that, at the addition of literature. The good news is that we found excellent, well thought out majors in both categories. The liberal arts type major at Millikan University, for example, which is a small liberal arts institution, is just a model for other majors for that kind of institution where you don't have the critical mass of either students or faculty to have a separate writing major. And it just makes sense for that kind of institution. The technical communication major at the Polytechnic campus of Arizona State, where Barry Maid is likewise a model for that technical communication kind of major. And the Department of Writing and Rhetoric at the University of Rhode Island has a wonderful major that I'll be talking about a little bit later in terms of how well thought out it is and how well crafted. But the bad news is that most of these majors were not so well thought out. The liberal arts writing majors were, and probably still are, the most problematic. And remember, in the 2008 data that we looked at, these were about half the total of our majors. As one member of the committee put it, most of these looked like English majors in drag. They weren't real writing majors. And, you know, as a committee, we could sort of imagine the kinds of conversations in the curriculum committees that went on when they put together these majors. Like, you know, we have this Chaucerian and he hasn't been able to teach anything for 5 years. His Chaucer seminar is never made. He needs something to do. So let's have a writing major and we'll make Chaucer a writing, you know, a core of that writing major. Many of these, and I'll go out on a limb and say most, they looked more like collections of courses that people wanted to teach rather than a coherent set of courses with outcomes that those courses led to. There was, you know, no rationale. And I wish I could say that the other one, you know, our professional rhetorical major was better. But in fact, for many of those, there were, and probably still are, that same lack of rationale. As Gertrude Stein said of Oakland, there's no there. You couldn't find the center. And we're not alone in having a major that doesn't seem to have a lot of coherence. If you look at the English major these days, and I've been, since I was chair of an English department for a while, I've done those kinds of outside reviews too. And now that the canon is gone, a lot of those English majors really just have no coherence. They look, again, like courses that people want to teach, or a series of area studies courses with no sort of final outcome in terms of learning. Where's the center? But as I said, the English major is declining, so that's probably not a great model. So there are 4 things that I think we need to think about as a field in terms of organizing a major. And those 4 are a set of outcomes, a gateway course that introduces students to the field, a set of core requirements and electives that are connected to outcomes, and a capstone course. There are probably others, but I think those are the 4 that we really need to be thinking about. So let me discuss each one of these in turn, and I'll mention some of the things that we need to be thinking about. First, a set of shared outcomes for all majors, regardless of type. And because as a field, we've been working on this issue. I mean, you've got the WPA writing outcomes for first-year composition. If you're not familiar with those, take a look at them on the web. They're very good, and you know, we've been talking about outcomes for a long time. So that should not be hard. Some programs that I've mentioned that I talked about earlier have developed their own set of outcomes, and I know that the committee at 4Cs is actually working on some general outcomes that they might present. But if you look at the other handout that I gave you, these are the outcomes from Rhode Island, from the Department of Writing and Rhetoric in Rhode Island. And I think that these could be a model for other majors. They have really thought carefully about this issue because unlike in other areas, they had to build this major from the ground up. And they had to pass all kinds of Senate, you know, committees and things like that. So you can see the 5 general areas that they have listed are rhetorical knowledge, process and collaborative textual evaluation, craft, genre, and editing, textual production and delivery, and reflective learning. And under each of those, they have listed outcomes. And if you look at the back, you can kind of read it, what they call this their roadmap. Rhode Island, get it? Roadmap, yeah. And what they've done is they've listed all their areas of that they want to emphasize with the outcomes underneath, and then across the top are their courses. The courses in bold are required courses, and then they have done this process called IRE, that is introduce, reinforce, and emphasize. Introduce means, you know, this is the first time the students see it. In another course, it's reinforced, and then finally E is the extended treatment, where the outcome is pulled out, questioned, practiced, problematized, whatever, at the upper level. And here's what Libby Miles, who's the chair of that department, has to say about the process of putting together this roadmap. The process of coding each outcome with IRE, that's, you know, introduce, reinforce, extend, ensured that we were offering multiple, repeated, and varied opportunities for practice with each of our outcomes. It meant that we had to build in repetition with increasing sophistication over time. Alternatively, it showed us in which of our courses might not be addressing our outcomes. That map was tremendously generative from a curricular development standpoint. And I particularly like this as a process to really think about your curriculum in the way that Jerome Bruner talks about curriculum as a spiral curriculum, where you are looking at some of the same issues, but with greater and greater sophistication as you mature and get older as a student. So I offer this map, and as I said, there's a more legible version on the web. You can just call it up easily, as a way that we might think about the connection between curriculum and outcomes as we talk about our major. Second, most majors in the university have some sort of gateway course that's an introduction to the major that helps students understand what the field is all about. It's an entry course, entry level, but it's also in some cases a gatekeeping course, making sure that the students who are going into your major can actually do the work that's involved in that major. And if you look at our first year course, our first year writing course, I don't see that as a great gateway course because it's so general. The only first year course that I know of that would fit this description as a gateway course is the one developed by Elizabeth Wardle and Doug Downs called Writing About Writing. And the textbook that they use has research studies from our field that are accessible to first year students. And they use that as an introduction to writing, but also an introduction to the discipline. And just as an aside, if I were still teaching, I would use that book. I love that book. So that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about is what's our gateway course? What is it like? What should it be like? Third, given a set of shared outcomes that we all agree should be in a major, no matter what kind of writing major we have, are there any core courses that we should have in that major? Anything that should be ensure that any student, no matter where they went to school, if they were in a writing major, they took that course. Specifically, since our field is heavy on praxis, what courses should be offered in areas like research methods, theory, and history to ensure a base of content as well as process knowledge in this area? For example, should we have a course in research methods? And I do not mean, you know, the research course that we now teach, which teaches students how to do research. What I mean is the course that teaches students about the two strands of research in our field. That is, the one that is more humanities-oriented and the one that is more social science-oriented that comes through us through education. I didn't see any course in the 2008 data that was like this. And my sense is that we might want to talk about that. That might be part of a conversation. Other disciplines have it. Should we? I don't worry a lot about theory courses because we know how to do theory, although I think we can agree literary theory is probably not something that belongs in a writing major, at least not this writing major. So I don't worry about that, but I do worry a little bit about history because we found in our 2008 data only one course in the history of rhetoric. And it seems to me that we should have students who know something about where our field came from. And I would like to see more of that in our major. And then the last issue, the capstone course, I don't think we need to say too much about that because many of these majors already have capstone courses. In some cases, that's because universities are requiring us to do this. In other cases, with technical and professional writing, it was an internship or something like that. What exactly the capstone course should be depends on the type of major, but I think we do need to think about this issue of a capstone, especially if we have a lot of majors that don't seem very coherent. And so how can you have a capstone that pulls a program of study together if your program of study is sort of, you know, not very organized? Finally, I want to mention one last broad issue because I want to leave time for questions. And this is related only tangentially to my topic, and so I hope you will indulge me because this is a favorite soapbox of mine. We need a research agenda. If you look on the web at the discipline of music education, you will find a wonderfully elegant research agenda with a whole series of areas where we need to know more about the field and then research questions that people can ask about that, research studies that they need to do. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rich Haswell's article about the war on research by NCTE and 4Cs. There used to be a lot of focus on research from our national organizations, and that has kind of disappeared. I think we really need to get back to get ourselves some hard data. Not only because we want to advance the state of knowledge in the field, I mean, that's why we all do research, right? But just as important, we need to show the results of best practice, and in some cases, justify best practice. And let me just remind you that although we all say, and NCTE says, that the maximum class size for a writing class should be 20, we do not have any hard research to back that up. And I remember one time a provost at my institution saying, you know, show me the research that says that your writing classes should be smaller. They were at 25, I wanted them back at 20. And so I thought, how hard can this be? I'll go out and I'll find this research. It's not there. We need that kind of research. Universities run on data, and we need to provide the data that will help justify best practice in our field. So these are the issues I think we need to be thinking about in the future, and I hope that some of you here will go forth and work on majors and do some of the research that needs to be done. But I want to end on a note of celebration. Our development as a discipline and our growth has happened very quickly in institutional terms. In my own lifetime, for example, my own professional lifetime. These are issues that I think a lot of people are working on right now. I'm not the only one who sees these as issues. And I think that we'll continue to work on them as we grow and develop in our own separate departments. To return to the domestic metaphor that Hairston used, we're still newly divorced from English in institutional terms, and the divorce, post-divorce period has been a little bit rocky, but I think we are finding our identity as a separate discipline, and we are poised now to take full advantage of our independence. So I think we have cause to celebrate as we think about our past, our present, and our future. And I'd be happy to take questions, but I've been told I can't move from this thing because they're recording, so.
So questions for our speaker?
Yes?
Can you speak a little bit further about what you mean about the history? You know, when you say where we come from, do you mean in terms of looking at the different trends, you know, in composition, theory, and then writing?
I mean the history of rhetoric, as well as, you know, what's happened recently. You know, starting with Aristotle.
Okay, so start with
Yeah,
Aristotle and then go
yeah.
forward with there. So.
Yeah, I mean, there are people that I've talked to who are in a writing major, they've never heard of Isocrates, for example. You really need to know that if you're in the field, I think. So, you know, maybe that's just me, but I think it's useful to know your own history.
Come on now. Come on.
Don't be shy. Yes?
So there wasn't a PhD program when you were going to school?
That's correct.
So was your PhD in English?
My PhD is in English, yes, Renaissance drama. And I chose John Webster because he only wrote 3 plays. And I figured I could write a dissertation that had an introduction, 3 chapters, and a conclusion. So that's what I did. And, you know, if you take a look at a lot of people my vintage, you find the same thing. In fact, not long ago, there was something published in 4Cs called Match the Writing Studies Scholar with his or her dissertation. And, you know, Peter Elbow's a Chaucerian, all that. So Ed White wrote about Jane Austen. You know, there weren't those programs when we were going to school. Sherry.
I'm going to kind of go out on a limb here to ask you about the future of writing programs when characteristically you were telling me these units, these programs, these departments are basically 2 or 3 tenured members, the rest lecturers.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true of departments as well as programs, although it's more true of ones that are programs.
Yeah.
And I think that's a serious issue, not only for us as a discipline, but for the university in general. With budget cuts, there are a lot of departments that are more like us than not, in that they have some tenure track and tenure people, and then they hire contingent faculty. And partly that's an issue of market. You know, especially in the community colleges, they hire a lot of people with a master's degree in English. And the master's in English literature is sort of the land that time forgot. What do you do with a master's in English literature? You go on for a PhD, or you wind up teaching writing as a contingent faculty member at the community college. And I think unless university budgets start improving, we're going to see just more and more contingent faculty.
So I agree.
Yeah, and many of them have wonderful credentials. I don't mean to denigrate contingent faculty, because they're some of the most splendid teachers I've ever run into.
But what I'm getting at is, if we're going to do these great things you've outlined,
Mm-hmm.
and I agree completely with you with what you've told us, if we don't have faculty to follow through, and a lecturer can't spend the time doing the research
Right.
necessary.
Mhm.
And, I mean, yes, they're wonderful teachers,
Mhm.
and they have all kinds of good things
Yeah.
to offer, but they can't give it.
One word: unionize.
Well, that's a good idea.
I think that's what's happening a lot of places. Contingent faculty are unionized, and if you've got a good, strong union, that's certainly what happened at UC Santa Barbara. We had a really strong union, and that meant that the contingent faculty, they're not Senate faculty, but they have job security and responsibilities that are equal to those of tenured faculty, except they're not paid nearly as well. It's a second-tier faculty. It's not a happy picture, I'm sorry to say. But you're right. I mean, you have to have people who are able to do this work and who are committed to it. And that's hard when the university isn't committed to you.
Right.
Yes, Chris?
You mentioned the gateway course.
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little? Yeah.
You mentioned writing about writing as a good example.
Yes.
How you can take the first year writing class and kind of translate it into a gateway
Mhm.
course. I'm just curious if you know of many programs that have successfully done that. And also, I love that book.
Yeah.
I use all that. But I haven't quite figured out how to teach it as a first year writing class. It seems like it's good for certain institutions it would work quite well. I haven't been quite sure how to teach it.
Yeah, I agree. And you have to think about the fact that we're different as a discipline in that we teach almost every freshman who comes through the door. And a lot of other disciplines that have their introductory course, like Introduction to Psychology, for example, which is a gen ed course, but it's also the first course that every psychology major has to take. It may be that we're different enough that we need a different gateway course. And there's a course at Rowan University. I forget what the name is. I think it's Introduction to Writing Studies. And if memory serves, it's a sophomore level course. And so that might be more suitable for us as a discipline, as a gateway course. Then you're not teaching every single student who's coming in, but you have a select group who think that they might want to be majors, and so they would take this course. I recommend that course to you. It's a very good course. You might want to take a look at it. What are you thinking about for the gateway course here?
Well, it's a course at the sophomore level.
Mhm.
It's going to be a GE course, but it's not in that GE writing area, so it's not every student in the university.
Has to take it.
And it's going to focus on the discipline through contemporary discourse.
Oh,
So-
okay.
So it'll
Yeah.
engage rhetorical principles
Mhm.
through contemporary discourse.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah. And I think it's modeled after what you've been talking about,
Uh-huh.
which is, makes me feel good, because
Yeah.
we're in line with what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, you might want to just look at the one at Rowan University and see, how it matches up,
That's
maybe
good.
get some ideas from them.
Good, yeah. Great.
Yes, in the back. Cesar,
Based on rhetoric and popular culture.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Based on rhetoric and popular
Yeah,
culture.
contemporary
So it
culture.
introduces students to thinking rhetorically through.
Your course does.
popular culture.
Uh-huh, okay, great. Are you going to teach us, Cesar?
Well, I was part of the three-person group who created. So,
Uh-huh.
teach
Cool.
Sid had a question.
Hi. When you were discussing the future,
Uh-huh.
I see a lot of similar language with like Common Core and then Basic Skills Initiative and Success Task Force. Is that where you're getting a lot of this from, or is there a connection or articulation? with some
No,
of these?
No, but a lot of these ideas are in the air. It's, I might think they're original with me, but, they're sort of floating around. And a lot of them, a lot of these things we talked about as a committee, and Barry Maid was on that committee. He was very helpful to us in thinking about, let's look at these majors and figure out if we can pull out some that are models that we can talk to people about. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and that was kind of brought up another one. So the data-driven language, speaking to the administration or use it as proof, what would you suggest for the type of research that would be done besides what you talked about?
Well, anything that generates serious numbers that can be replicable, that you do it again and again. And I realize that one of the reasons we don't have a lot of research on class sizes is that kind of research is really hard to do because there's so many variables. But it is possible. It is possible to do it. And we really need, if you're going to do this kind of research, and I'm not a statistician, and so when I started working on these kinds of things, I made sure that I made friends with people who were psychometricians who could help me with this. And Rich Haswell's amazing that way. But the first thing that I figured out when I became chair of the English department at Washington State was that there was this little book that the provost had called the Provost Decision Support Data. And it was all numbers. And it was, how many FTE, how many, all this stuff that, I was an English major. I couldn't figure it out. And so I had to have somebody sit down and explain to me, this is how the provost makes decisions about budgets, and you'd better understand it. And Glenn is nodding his head, for those of us who are English, numbers are not our friends. Numbers are sort of our in-laws. But you really need to know. You really need to know this. The university runs on numbers, and you need to be able to present information to those people who are in charge, many of whom are engineers and scientists, and they know numbers, the stuff that will make sense to them. Did I answer your question? There was a hand back there.
I guess it was brought up creative writing courses being jealously guarded by English programs.
Yeah.
And sometimes even if they weren't being used. But
Sorry, I'm getting glared at by the guy who's doing the video. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess my question about that sort of thing is, do we really want the creative writing specifically? Or, I'm not being snobby.
No, I understand. In fact, there was a very interesting article not long ago, Does Creative Writing Belong in a Writing Major? And you might want to look up that article. It was in the C's, right? Yeah. And there are arguments for and against. If you've got a technical and professional writing major, no, you probably don't want creative writing in there, but maybe you do. Maybe somebody wants to be a technical writer and then write the great American novel at night. It just depends on who are your students. A lot of these majors are site-specific. And so you can't ever say, this is the one true holy Catholic major. It's going to depend on who your students are, what kinds of resources you have, who you have to teach it, all of that. We were putting together, we had a writing minor at UC Santa Barbara. We were putting together a joint doctoral program. We were still trying to think about putting together a major. And one of the things we were seriously thinking about was putting in creative writing as well. Because we had a lot of wonderful MFAs who could have taught that course, and we had a lot of students who really wanted to take it. So it just depends. I don't think you can say categorically creative writing does not belong. I think it depends. I think we have time for one more. Yeah, way in the back.
I was wondering if you have come across any issues of colleges who don't recognize rhetoric writing studies, that the writing department is under the English or language and literature department, and I don't know if this is an isolated situation, but where I've gone and said, can I teach writing with the rhetoric and writing studies, and I would be required to go through an equivalency review board versus they wanted a graduate student with composition or English background. So how do you come across that issue? Is that a problem with RWS and being recognized?
You're talking about the issue of certification to teach particular courses? Is that what the issue is? I think the issue of certification is always a question at any institution. You want to make sure that you have somebody who really knows what they're doing. And in some cases, people think that's a piece of paper. It's lucky that was not the case when Sherry and I were starting out, because we had this doctorate in English that said we knew how to teach writing, and in fact we were among the group that were sort of figuring it out way at the beginning. I think it's an important issue. I don't think that it's a serious issue for the discipline unless it's really widespread. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
I think you are. I think that it's kind of an unknown maybe at this point, that that's just an isolated incident.
Yeah, I mean, at Washington State University, they came up to me at one point and said, we really need you to teach Shakespeare because our Shakespearean is on sabbatical. And, I hadn't taught Shakespeare in 100 years, but, my degree was in Renaissance drama, so naturally I could teach Shakespeare. So I spent quite a bit of time sort of boning up and trying to figure out what had happened in 30 years with Shakespeare scholarship, but, I had the degree that said I could do it, so they thought I could. And I sort of stumbled through it, but other questions? Okay, thank you very much. If you have other ones, come and talk to me.